Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Friends to count on. Once upon a time, there lived a lovely princess named Snow White. Her wicked stepmother, the queen, dreaded that someday Snow White would be more beautiful than she was. Every day the queen asked her magic mirror, "Who is the fairest one of all?" And every day the mirror replied, "You are." But one day the mirror gave a different answer. "Snow White," it said. The queen was enraged. She ordered the royal huntsman to take Snow White into the woods and kill her. That day, the queen would be the most beautiful woman in the kingdom again. But the huntsman couldn't bring himself to harm Snow White. When they got to the forest, he told the princess how much the queen hated her. "Run away," he told her. "Hide." Snow White turned and ran as quickly as she could, but the woods were scary. Branches seemed to reach for her, and roots tripped her. She felt as if eyes were staring at her from the darkness. Snow White screamed. Then she fell and buried her head in fear. In the morning, Snow White lifted her head. She saw eyes watching her, but this time they were friendly eyes of bunnies, deers, chipmunks, birds, and raccoons. Snow White was glad she wasn't alone anymore. "Please don't run away," she said. "I won't hurt you." Snow White knew she could never return to the castle. What would she do? Where would she go? "Maybe the animals can help me," she thought. "I need a place to sleep at night," she said. The animals looked at each other. The birds took her cape in their beaks and guided her forward. Soon they came to a clearing in the woods. Beneath the trees stood a charming little cottage. "Just like a dollhouse," Snow White cried. She peeked in the window. No one was home. The animals nodded at her, seeming to say it was all right for her to go inside. Snow White pushed the door open. Inside the cottage, dishes were piled high in the sink, and clothes were tossed about. The floor hadn't been swept in ages. Snow White counted the tiny chairs at the table and decided 7 children must live in the cottage. 7 untidy children, she said with a shake of her head. Snow White grabbed a broom. "We'll clean the house and surprise them," she said to the animals. "Then maybe they'll let me stay." She started to sweep, singing all the while. The raccoons washed clothes, the deers dusted, and the chipmunks tidied. In no time the room was spotless. After the cleaning was done, Snow White became curious about the rest of the cottage. "Let's see what's upstairs," she said. She lit a candle and climbed up the steps. At the top of the door, Snow White opened it and went into a room with 7 little beds. Each bed had a name carved on it: Doc, Happy, Sneezy, Dopey. Snow White said with a laugh, "What funny names for children." She read on: Grumpy, Bashful, and Sleepy. By then Snow White was feeling awfully sleepy herself. She lay down across 3 of the small beds. The birds covered her with a blanket, and minutes later the princess was fast asleep. Before long, the owners of the cottage returned. They were not children at all. They were dwarves. When they opened the door, they couldn't believe their eyes. "The whole house is clean," Doc exclaimed. Nervously, the dwarves tippy-toed upstairs. They thought an intruder was in their room. They went in and Doc slowly pulled away the blanket that had been covering Snow White. "Why, it's a girl!" he cried. "An angel," whispered Bashful, but Grumpy thought differently. "All females are poison," he insisted. As Snow White began to wake up, the nervous dwarfs hid. They peeked at her over the footboards. The princess yawned and sat up. Startled, she caught sight of the dwarf's face. "Oh, you're little men," she cried. "Now don't tell me who you are. Let me guess." One by one she matched the names on the bed to the dwarfs. She got all of them right on the first try. Snow White told the dwarfs how she had run through the woods and that the queen wanted to kill her. "Send her away," Grumpy warned the other dwarfs. He was worried that the queen might use an evil magic spell on them. "She won't find me here," the princess promised. "I'll wash and keep house and cook." The dwarves imagined the apple dumplings and gooseberry pies that Snow White would make. "She stays," they agreed. Then they followed her downstairs. That night, after a delicious dinner, the dwarves and Snow White yodeled and sang. Dopey played the drums, Sleepy played the horn, and Grumpy played the pipe organ. Snow White clapped along to the music. Then she danced with her new friends. The dwarves had never had so much fun or laughed so hard. When they stopped singing and dancing, Sleepy turned to Snow White. "Tell us a story," he said. Snow White told them about a princess who had fallen in love with a prince she met at a wishing well. "Was it you?" they asked, as she nodded. Her dearest wish was to see him again someday. Sighing dreamily, the dwarves let Snow White sleep in their cozy beds for the night. Bashful slept in a drawer, and Happy climbed into a cupboard. Doc chose the sink, while Grumpy hopped in a large pot. They didn't mind. Even Grumpy was glad that Snow White had stayed. In the morning, the dwarves got ready to go to work in the mines. They were worried about leaving Snow White alone, especially after what the queen had tried to do to her. "I'll be all right," Snow White said. Then she kissed each of the dwarves goodbye. "I'm warning ya. Don't let nobody or nothing in the house," Grumpy ordered. "Oh, Grumpy, you do care," Snow White exclaimed and gave him a big kiss. He stomped away, pretending to be mad, but he had a goofy smile on his face. That afternoon, forgetting Grumpy's warning, Snow White allowed a poor old woman into the house. The woman gave her an apple, perfectly red and shiny. "Go on, have a bite," she urged. But the apple was not an ordinary apple, and the old woman was not an ordinary woman. She was the evil queen in disguise, and the fruit had been poisoned. Snow White's animal friends tried to warn her not to trust the woman, but she didn't understand. She reached out, raised the apple to her lips, and took a bite. "Oh, I feel strange," she cried, and fell to the floor. When the dwarves returned to the house, they found their friend and thought she was dead. They had no way of knowing that the spell the queen had used was for a sleeping death, or that love's first kiss could wake Snow White up. The dwarves could not bear to lose the princess. They built her a beautiful coffin of gold and glass and set it in the woods where all her animal friends could visit her. One day, a prince came by, the same prince that Snow White had met by the wishing well. He gazed at her in the glass coffin and knew her as the princess he loved. The prince lifted the glass, bent down, and kissed her. Slowly she awakened. The prince lifted her in his arms. Around them the dwarves and the animals danced and hugged and jumped for joy. Their friend was alive again, and her true love had found her. "Goodbye," Snow White said, and kissed each of the dwarves. She was leaving to marry the prince, but she knew she would visit her good friends again soon. The end.